Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our session today. My name is Amy Wood, and I am the Senior Director of Talent Operations and Programs at OneTrust. I'm so excited to be here and to delve into a topic that's become absolutely central to the way that we work. In today's world, data is no longer just a luxury, it's a necessity. And in the ever-evolving realm of talent acquisition, it's really a game changer. So we're here today to unravel the many ways data is not just influencing, but actively shaping the future of recruitment. We'll start by taking a look at the significance of data. It's not just a bunch of numbers and charts. It's a compelling story of our journey, struggles, and triumphs. Understanding and identifying the right data can help us map out our strategy and take a leap into a future-ready recruitment process. So today we have an exceptional panel. I want to introduce Jenna Foster, who is the Director of Executive Talent Insights and Research at Capital One. Welcome, Jenna.
Thank you so much for the warm intro, Amy.
Of course.
Pleased to be here today for a session that I also feel is just integral to everything that we do in recruiting these days. At Capital One, I lead the Research and Market Insights team as part of the executive recruiting organization. And my background is at Korn Ferry and Google in a number of different knowledge management, talent intelligence, and consulting roles. So pleased to be here today for the discussion.
I love that. Thank you. And I would also like to welcome Shabazz Ali, who is the Director of Talent Acquisition at Zillow. And he will share unique insights into the evolving landscape of talent acquisition. So welcome, Shabazz.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Jenna. Nice to meet you as well. I'm looking forward to this session because I think Amy said it very well, that these days without data, you can't really do justice to talent acquisition. What I do is at Zillow is I lead our recruitment enablement and experience team. We pretty much look at the entire process, the entire candidate journey. We look at all the tech stack and see what makes sense. How can we be more efficient and effective? And how can we be more data driven? So this is very much aligned with my passion and my experience both at Zillow and my previous organizations like Amazon and GE.
That's great. All right, welcome both, and let's dive in. So to kick us off, what advice would you offer to companies really just starting their journey into data-driven talent acquisition?
I think one thing that I can say is that, the complexity, and I'm sure Jenna will agree with me, the complexity when it comes to data is when you have too many different disparate systems and you're trying to pull the data together from all of them. At Zillow, we're very fortunate that we have a very incredible analytics team within our people organization in our HR function. And that analytics team does a remarkable job of really bringing all the data together from these different systems. So I think having a really sound analytics team with folks who know data, who are maybe data scientists and can actually use the data in a way that it creates a story is really important. So having those fundamentals, in my opinion, is really key to success.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Shabazz. And I think when thinking about data and using data, it's really easy to think about just the ideal state and what perfect looks like. And I think that, and I think it was Voltaire said, perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think that it's just important to start somewhere and really wrap your arms around what data do you have now? What do you wish you had? And sort of working through a roadmap of how do you get there? And measuring then what's sort of the give and take? Because in a perfect world, we'd all have great data that's clean and tells us a story and guides not only our recruiting strategy, but also the growth strategy of the company. But the reality is much sort of messier than that. So, my advice would be to just start with building blocks and work your way up from there.
Absolutely. I love those answers. And I think, one of the great things about all of our roles is that we have the opportunity to kind of influence the process and the data and how that comes together and technology, right? Like we can see the full scope. And I think that really helps us be able to put the right information in to be able to get the data that we want to get to that future state you were talking about, Jenna. That makes sense. In your thoughts, what would you define as really foundational metrics and like what's kind of core that, is absolute table stakes?
I think this is an interesting question because I think there is sort of a one size fits all answer, and then there's absolutely not as well. I think that some of the foundational metrics that come to mind relate to pass-through rates, to really just fundamentally understanding where you're hiring from and breaking that down by different levels and functions. And while that may not feel like groundbreaking information, I think you have to define what the box is in order to think outside the box. And that box might look different based on your objectives. But I think that foundationally speaking, having a good sense of your pass-through rates, where and why candidates are falling out of the process, and also then applying that to the top of the funnel is a great place to start.
Absolutely. That tells us a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's no one right answer to this question. I think it depends on where you are in your journey and your kind of growth. For example, I think some of the fundamental metrics that I'm passionate about are funnel metrics, right? Knowing exactly how much time it's taking in each step of the process, because that really gives you good insight into the candidate journey and really figuring out what your bottlenecks are. I think every organization that I've been in have tried to measure quality of hire. I know it's one of the most difficult metrics to measure, simply because you need data from both talent acquisition as well as talent management. But I think if you have the right maturity and a centralized analytics function within your organization, you can achieve that state of nirvana and be able to measure quality of hire. I'll tell you one interesting metric, which has become kind of useful since the pandemic, and that is the metric called ghosting. Because we have seen in many, especially in tech industries, that after the pandemic, that candidates started ghosting or just like kind of getting out of the funnel, either at the early stages or in the middle at the assessments or during interviews. And it's not easy to measure, but it's really good, insightful data in terms of when the candidates are dropping out, so that you can really understand why they're dropping out and you can do something about it.
Absolutely. And I think all of this really leads us to a place where we can partner better with the business, right? And be able to share powerful insights that will help us all get better. Because as we know, hiring is really a team sport and it's not necessarily just recruiting. How do you both think that TA can better position themselves as strategic partners to the C-suite or to just their day-to-day business partners?
This is probably the question that gets me the most excited. And I think I've had the joy of working in different roles related to competitive intelligence and benchmarking and thinking about not just using data in the recruiting process for strategy or sourcing strategy, which you absolutely should and can, but thinking about how that same data or a different view of that data can help really educate the hiring managers and executives and sort of bring it to the whole talent ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, recruiting can be sort of order taking on this is who we need in this spot at this time, and it's this perfect storm of navigating, the addressable market and who's available in the right place, and will they take the offer, and navigating all of these things that have to come together. But the reality is that recruiting begins so much before that, and I think that the way that this looks is very organizationally dependent. I think if you're a higher growth, smaller company, it'll be about location strategy and where should you be thinking about growing next. For more established companies with not looking to change their footprint, it's about, how can we maximize, or where do we actually anticipate having challenges that we can think through, and then equip HRBPs and hiring managers and recruiters with the same information about, hey, we think it's going to be pretty hard to find this role in this market. Let's think about how we can think outside the box, whether that's skills, competencies, is relocation available, et cetera. So I think that this is one of those critical pieces that kind of gets pushed to the wayside when things get really busy. And I'm hopeful that, in resource-constrained environments, that companies aren't just viewing this as a nice to have, that it truly drives better outcomes for everyone across the business.
I think I totally agree with Jenna. Anytime that you share your operational metrics to the business leadership or the C-suite, you'll never get the ahas or the wows, right? And in order to really get to have a seat at the table with your business, you need to first listen to the business, right? What exactly are their priorities, right? As Jenna said, are we looking to go into a different market? Are we trying to grow a certain segment? Are we trying to do acquisitions and mergers? Are we trying to right size? Are we trying to reduce attrition? And really understanding those variables and then working backwards from them to be able to take the data that you have and share a story with your internal customers really makes a difference. I think the other variable that I think is really insightful is we usually in talent acquisition, sometimes we get too internally focused and we look at our own data, right? Our own funnel metrics and our own number of applicants and offer accepts and all that. And we miss out an important piece, which is external market data. I think hiring managers, business leaders, HR business partners, they're looking for that market intelligence. And if talent acquisition can take the internal data and then add some external market intelligence and then provide that information, in a form of a white paper or something along those lines on a regular basis, that's when you get the ahas and the wows from your internal stakeholders.
Yes, absolutely. I'm nodding vigorously. I have a fun example of this where I had an executive come and they were kind of up in arms about the acceptance rate for engineers because they were looking at software engineering versus go-to-market acceptance rates within our company. And then when we pulled the market, industry benchmarks that were available, it was like, actually, our offer acceptance rate is really strong in comparison to the market. When you're looking at software engineers versus sales reps, maybe not, but that's apples and oranges. So being able to provide the full context for them really, really helps with how we're looking into things. So I love that and totally agree with that answer. Okay, so moving on a little bit to thinking about data integrity. This question is for Jenna. Given your focus on talent insights and research, what common pitfalls have you observed in maintaining data integrity, and how specifically does Capital One manage this?
Yes, and data integrity is one of those things that is both all of my job and none of it specifically all at once. I think data integrity it hits on the point that I made earlier about perfect being the enemy of the good. And I think that it's very easy to fall into this idea that we can only use data that is right, that is 100% correct. But the reality is that the story that you're telling doesn't necessarily require something to be academically and intellectually right. There's always this art and science to recruiting data. And even the metrics that are relatively straightforward, sort of number of recs, really there's a much bigger story to that as well. Not every rec takes the same effort or sourcing strategy or time invested. And so I think that it's really important to have the right priorities when thinking about data integrity. So if you have a CRM, we recently implemented one in executive recruiting at Capital One, and it's, yes, we'd love to have all of our data be absolutely correct and up to date at all times, but truthfully, that's just, that's not feasible for any team to manage within their day-to-day work. And so it's about having the right priorities, deciding what and why information needs to be put into the system consistently. And I think that's the operative term, consistency, more than perfection, will get you much further. And I think it's important to think ahead, think around some corners, around what are we trying to do with this data from the system? And if we do it this way or that way, are we going to cause issues and then have to go back and, spend hours updating all of it? Everybody's done that, I'm sure. If you've been through a CRM implementation, there's things you could do differently. But I think that it's really about having the right priorities. And to Shabaz's earlier point about data, sort of external market data, internal data, then internal data about associates related to performance management and things. There's so much to look at that it can feel very overwhelming. So I think that back to those building blocks of data integrity, focus on clean data in. And in fact, my team, I've made up a mantra and everybody sort of giggles every time I say it, but good data in is good data out. And I'll leave that with you all here today. Good data in, good data out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that approach. And I think, I think of things very similarly in that, really sunlight is the best disinfectant. And sometimes we have this chicken and the egg scenario where it's like, we need to get our data clean before we start showing it. But showing it is also a great way to be able to identify where the gaps may be and where there may be, process improvements that we can make. So I really like your approach there and agree with that. And Shabaz, you've got a rich history in both HR and TA transformation. So what are some challenges you faced at Zillow or in other places, kind of maintaining the quality and relevance of your overall talent data?
Yeah, I think one is, this age-old challenge in talent acquisition about data integrity. And I think part of it stems from the fact that, you've got different systems, right? You have your ATS, you have your CRM, you have these point solutions like scheduling, assessments, and so on. And then how do you make sure that you have really robust data is always a challenge. So I think as Jenna said, you cannot expect that state of nirvana that it's going to be 100% accurate, because sometimes it's also when the data was loaded, is it real time? Is it once a day? Is it once a month, and so on? And sometimes those are some of the variables that can impact the data integrity. I always encourage my team to have an agile mindset and not wait for perfection, because otherwise you're always going to be late, or you may have job security because you're working on the same thing forever, but you never get to launch it. So I always say, hey, if you get to 80%, let's start showing it. Let's start talking about it. Let's start, training people about it. And then we can improve, we can tweak, we can enhance, and we can get to somewhere around 98, 99% accurate. But if you wait till it's 100% fully baked and then you decide to show it, it's too late. The game is over. One of the things that we're working on at Zillow, especially in our new strategy, is making sure that we can also provide access to data in the system where the transaction is done. So let me explain what I mean by that. Right now, we do a great job in our analytics team in taking the data from all of these different systems and putting them into really user-friendly dashboards, right? That is phase one. That's the right thing to do. However, the disadvantage with that is you always have to go to now another place, another link where you go and see your dashboards. So the ideal state is that you have really on-demand reporting, and the reporting and the data is in the system where you're doing the transaction. So in our case, what we're doing is we're going back to the basics, kind of what Jenna said, right? Making sure that our CRM is the source of truth for all of our sourcing data. And then for all of our recruiting data, and anytime a candidate becomes an applicant, all of that data is in our applicant tracking system. And this way we have more better integrity with our data. And also we can actually look at the data, look at the funnel metrics and everything else within the systems where we are doing the transaction. So if I'm a sourcing leader, I shouldn't have to go to multiple places. I should be able to really quickly access my data within my CRM. And if I'm a recruiting leader, I should be able to see that within my ATS. You still need those dashboards to really showcase or create a storyboard for external customers like hiring managers and HR business partners. But for internal users like sources and recruiters and recruiting leaders, we want that data and the reporting to be within the systems, again, where we do the transactions, which is our ATS and our CRM, as an example.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And that helps drive the right performance, right? When recruiters can see real time, how their metrics are changing, then that helps drive the right path forward. And I think, if we'll get any theme out of this panel, it's definitely like, let's work towards good, not work towards perfection, right? Like get 80% of the way there. And, because as we know, in fast-paced environments, things are always changing. So yeah. I really agree with that perspective. All right. So thinking about data agility now, Shabazz, can you share a situation where real-time data allowed Zillow to adapt to an emerging challenge or an opportunity quickly?
Yeah, I'll give you a non-talent acquisition example. And I think if all of us who are maybe in the housing, as a consumer of the housing market, at Zillow, there is within the Zillow app, you can see Z estimate. This is a feature or a functionality that has been with Zillow app for, I think, about 10 years. And that is really using real-time data as well as AI to really provide some really good insights. We use AI and real-time data at Zillow to improve our customer experience, our employee experience, but also we can use that data to do predictive analytics and provide intelligence and really understanding on how the markets are moving, what is going to be the growth market. Is it going to be a renter's market? Is it going to be a buyer's market or a seller's market? And then you can look at that data by different locations, by different geographies. So I think having real-time data, and again, coupled with AI, gives you that intelligence that you can use to really, problem solve really big problems, both internally within the organization, but also for our customers. That is those who are either looking to buy or rent a home.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned predictive analytics. So I'm curious from both of you, how are you thinking or using predictive analytics in your recruitment metrics specifically?
This is something we talked a lot about at Google, unsurprisingly, being a very data-driven company. And we used to try to make predictions in the talent intelligence team on what we saw ahead in the future. And this was, maybe a little bit more macro level than recruitment strategy. But I think that the principles still very much apply. And I think it's less that you're trying to be absolutely right. So again, the same theme of you're going for like the B+ answer, not the A+, and actually that's great. Where you're just trying to be on the front foot in such a dynamic industry. I mean, people are dynamic. One day a candidate will say they don't want to relocate for XYZ reason, and the next day something big changes and that completely shifts. And I think that anyone who's in research or recruiting knows how quickly things can change. And I think being predictive then can feel a little bit fruitless. Well, why are we trying to, predict what everyone's going to do when really there's not a logic to it necessarily. But I think that the thought exercise fundamentally itself is really important. And trying to forecast hiring demand is something that I think any company can put together a model, and maybe it's spot on and maybe it's not, because there are so many externalities that influence that over the year. But trying to think ahead about what's happening in the world macroeconomically, how can we get a bit smarter on what everyone else is doing, and where do we see trends going with key peer companies and things. And so I think there's a sort of two-pronged approach, again, with thinking about internally your own direction and then the external market, and then finding the right information and level of connectivity there to drive the right behaviors, to try to map out the market, to understand the addressable markets for talent pools that you're looking at, to anticipate obstacles. And there will always be things you've not thought of or never, could have predicted. But really putting yourself in the shoes of candidates, business leaders, of hiring managers, and trying to think ahead to everyone else's perspective can be really powerful in how you think about capturing data and bringing data together and mining that from your systems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Shabazz, you touched on this briefly a little bit with kind of like the in-app experience for insights for folks on the recruiting team. Are there any specific tools or practices that you would recommend for companies wanting to really up their data agility game?
Yeah, I think first, Amy, this is a really important question that you asked. And I think it's even more important since the pandemic. Because if you think about it, the recruiting trends are now so unpredictable, right? And things are changing so quickly that you can't really now forecast, 3 years and 1 year down the road. So one of the practice that I'm a big advocate of is looking at, forecasts on a quarterly basis and have really an agile and dynamic organization so that you can, pivot as things are changing. I think that's one. I'll tell you, I keep CNBC and Fox Business News both, on most of the day. And I think part of it is, to Jenna's point, you have to keep a pulse on macroeconomic changes, because those are so dynamic now and so fluid that it can turn from having, great recession in the first 2 quarters of let's say last year, and then suddenly things change, turn upside down, and your attrition goes from 30% to maybe less than 4 or 5%. And what does that mean from a recruiting standpoint? So I think having a real strong pulse on macroeconomic trends, and I think as recruiting leaders and even as HR practitioners, I think now more than ever you have to have a really robust, information gathering system, not just internal data and internal information, but also external, and use that to do your predictive analytics. So we're using some tools that provides us with market intelligence. We work with those vendors to really get better data for certain markets or certain trends, and then use that data to tell the story and figure out what the forecast will look like. But it's getting harder and harder to predict. So I think whoever can solve for this is going to have a big win in coming years.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. Jenna, anything to add on that?
Shabazz, actually, that one of your comments just reminded me of a quote that one of my colleagues shared, which is to say that the best life jacket is one that someone will wear. And I think that data that really applies. I think that when people are thinking about market intelligence and talent intelligence, and not, maybe a smaller company can't afford to have all of the different tools, and it sort of makes you feel like you're behind. But the reality is that the best data for you is what you have available and what you do with it as well. And so I think that it can be very easy to feel like having a certain new tool or tech platform will solve the answer. But really, I think it's most critical that you can tell the right story to the right person at the right time to actually drive results with that data.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yes, I love how philosophical we're getting. This is great. Now, switching gears a little bit to future-proofing strategy, right? We're talking a lot about predictive analytics. We're talking a lot about, planning and, keeping up with the macroeconomic climate. Jenna, this question's for you to kick us off. How have you tailored recruitment strategy at Capital One, or more broadly, really based on data projections? And what were the results?
It's a really great question, because I think that, to some of the earlier points, it's very difficult these days to really predict where the market is going and what will influence that. I think when I think about data influencing strategy, one thing that comes to mind in particular on the sourcing side and candidate ID research is not making any assumptions about the information that you have available to you, which is to say, looking at someone's LinkedIn profile and making an assumption about where they're working today or where they live, and is it even accurately represented on LinkedIn. And I think that continuing to push ourselves on judgment calls and bias and assumptions, that I think the industry as a whole has worked really hard to do that in certain contexts of reading resumes without, sort of just relying on snap judgments around schools and prestige, as it maybe once was defined, and being more open to different skill sets and looking at competencies rather than just a title in someone's background. And I think that thinking ahead in, being on the front foot with research is just picking up the phone and having those conversations with candidates and not making too many assumptions that you have perfect data just because it's the data that's available to you. And I think the same can be extrapolated to hiring demand and recruiting strategy on a broader scale as well. You have the information in front of you and you're making the best decision with that information now, but not being too precious about holding on to a certain assumption or conclusion or decision, and being willing to pivot will ultimately, I think, draw the most success.
Yes, definitely. I love the overlap around really how we think about building diversity on our team that you called there, because as we know, the best time to start your diversity strategy is yesterday. And, I think a lot of times people get caught up in the how and the why. And that is really a great example of how we start to break down our preconceived bias, is just, pick up the phone, get on a call, learn, be curious. And I think all of that really ties in. And that's why we're here as recruiters, right? That's why our teams are here. And that's why we're interviewing, to really, bring that value. Otherwise, we'd just be looking at a LinkedIn profile and making a hiring call. So I love the way that you thought through that. And then broadly for the group, how can talent acquisition teams better align with the C-suite, with their business partners, in advising which recruiting metrics are really crucial for business success?
I think on this one, I'll say, you got to go back to kind of having really robust sort of, process for gathering voice of your customer, right? And I mean internal customer, right? Like your C-suite, and really having a true understanding of what's important to them. Where is the business going? What are their priorities? Are we trying to expand in certain industries or in certain locations? Are we trying to do acquisitions and mergers? Are we trying to right-size our business in certain places? And then working backwards from it and saying, okay, what can talent acquisition, what can recruitment do to make a difference? And then from there, you can work backwards. One of the tools, I know if you're in consumer business, right, whether you're in banking, healthcare, tech, any place, right, if you're in finance, you're always working on scenario planning. I think now that is one of the ways that I think that is a skill that recruitment leaders have to really learn now is scenario planning, figuring out, okay, what will be your goals, right? What is your attrition, looking at other variables, and then figuring out what's the best, worst, and most ideal or most realistic scenario, and be able to look at those scenarios on a regular basis. I often encourage that you have your information as best as you can for today, right? Things can change very quickly, so you need to be able to look at the data on a quarterly basis at least, and then be able to pivot your recruiting strategy based off of either the data, what the data is telling you, or the anecdotal data. Sometimes we forget that the anecdotal inputs that you get from the C-suite is as important as the data itself. So having both the qualitative and quantitative data, and then being able to use that to drive your annual and quarterly strategies is going to give you, the recruiting leaders, a seat at the table with the C-suite.
Absolutely. I think, that's also a great view or lens to put on this for depending on the maturity of different organizations, right? Because not all organizations have an annual headcount plan that they stick to, that we know, 12 months in advance what we're going to be hiring for, especially in this climate. There's a lot of flux. So having that agility built into your team and having processes set up that you're revisiting that data, I think is really useful. Jenna, what about you?
Yeah. So something that came to mind in particular was really context. I think that it's very easy to feel, especially with C-suite executives or executives at any level, that they know the market. They're in the market. They're executives. Of course, they know the market. But I think the reality is that they know the market from one lens, but not necessarily from a talent acquisition lens. And I think it's also really important for recruiters to bring a strong perspective about how recruiting is not just about the hires. I think there's this sense, and it is very real, that when hiring demand drops or you're not hiring as much, it's like, well, gosh, what are we going to do? And the reality is that that's when you get into the really meaty, fun stuff, in my opinion. Thinking about succession planning and getting to know even how other organizations are structured and designed, and thinking ahead to some of that scenario planning that you mentioned, Shabazz, where you need to have a plan for someone to leave the organization and be prepared to jump in. It's not to say that everyone is replaceable, one for one, but it's really important to have those key objectives and priorities outlined. And I think that sort of narrative partnership and being willing to come with a point of view, recognizing that an executive might think otherwise, and maybe data resonates with one person and it really doesn't with another, and try not to take that personally as you're doing your job wrong. It's really meeting people where they're at and bringing them along in a way that supports their objectives and yours.
Yeah, Amy, if I may add to it, one of the things that we're doing at Zillow is kind of changing the mindset of our recruitment teams and saying, okay, you need to think of yourself as a talent advisor, right? Because that is a whole different way of looking at your role. And that means, even when you don't have too many recs, for example, that's not a bad thing. That is actually a great time for you to either upskill yourself. It's a great time to really, to Jenna's point, look at, other parts of the puzzle, right? Look at how talent management does things, look at how succession planning is done, and being able to connect the dots. And then even, when we do intake meetings, for example, with the hiring managers or business leaders, right, make them more strategic. Do monthly business reviews, quarterly business reviews with your internal customers, and that really earns trust. And I think if you earn trust of the business, then when things go wrong, which sometimes they do in recruiting, right? You will not have a lot of trouble with your internal customers. But it's important to earn trust and do that proactively by doing monthly and quarterly business reviews with your hiring managers, HRBPs, etc. It goes a long ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. The theme I'm picking up from this is that, recruiting is not just an order taking team anymore. We're not here only to fill requisitions. And as we all know, there's a lot of other work that goes into it outside of just the pure candidate funnel. And there's a lot of work to do consistently, especially if we want to get ahead. So thank you both for that. And I'm going to start wrapping us up at this point. So I really want to thank you, Jenna and Shabazz, for spending the time and sharing the phenomenal insights from your experience. This was, I learned a lot, and I hope the rest of our listeners did as well. So thank you so much.